Several years ago now, I was introduced to postmodern philosophy through Jordan Peterson. He kept going on and on about how dangerous postmodernism was.
You need to understand postmodernism because that's what you're up against, and you're up against it far more than you know or think. And it's a much more well-developed and pervasive, pernicious, nihilistic, intellectually attractive doctrine than has yet come to public realization. It absolutely dominates the humanities and increasingly the social sciences in the universities.
But he never fully explained what postmodernism was. The closest thing he ever came was saying that postmodernism is Marxism disguised as identity politics, which is a bit like saying a snail is a bug disguised as a rock, and it doesn't really tell you anything about what a snail actually is. So I began looking into postmodernism for myself, and quickly realized Peterson was completely ignorant on the topic. Having just made a video about the postmodern condition, I thought it would be fun to revisit Peterson and address his ignorance. Let's start by fleshing out Peterson's central claim before we begin to refute them. Firstly, he makes a historical claim that in the late 60s and early 70s, people were abandoning Marxism because of the atrocities of the Soviet Union. Right away we should talk about May 1968, as it is particularly important when discussing Marxism in France. That month, students and workers gathered together in the biggest strike in living memory. Many of the leaders of these strikes were devout Marxists. There were many violent clashes between police and protesters, with 600 people wounded after the night of May 6th. The 29th of May, the President of France, Charles de Gaulle, left the country and it looked like the students and the workers had won. However, the President returned a couple of days later, as he had struck a deal with the unions. They helped him calm the population in exchange for pay increases and benefits. Though there were many cultural changes in France as a consequence of the strike, there was no substantial political change. So, when Peterson claims that Marxism fell from grace around the late 60s or early 70s, he neglects to mention how the May 68 riots' failure to create change contributed to people's loss of faith in Marxism, a clear sign of his ignorance. Secondly, Peterson believes that postmodernists are indeed Marxists, who responded to Marxism's loss of popularity by pulling a sleight of hand, as he puts it, and replacing rich versus poor with oppressor versus oppressed. Now, this claim is a little weird, for many reasons, but let's just accept it at its face value. To confirm it, there has to be established a firm connection between Marxism and postmodernism, as well as a firm connection between postmodernism and identity politics. To fully examine these connections, we're going to have to look at the postmodern thinkers individually, as postmodernism is an umbrella term used about thinkers who differ greatly from each other. We'll start with Lyotard, one of the few thinkers called postmodern who actually used the term himself. Lyotard was indeed a Marxist thinker, as he wrote and edited for Marxist journals in the 1950s. However, in the middle of the 1960s, Lyotard began attending the lectures of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, after which he lost all faith in the all-encompassing narrative of Marxism. As a consequence of his break from Marxism, Lyotard lost many of his closest friends, because Marx was still held in high regard by most French academics. In other words, Lyotard didn't abandon Marxism because it had become unpopular, as Peterson thinks. He abandoned Marxism at great personal cost, because he felt it wasn't helpful anymore. Moving on, a postmodern thinker who was openly Marxist was Gilles Deleuze. He was a thinker who concerned himself mostly with the history of philosophy. This changed, however, after May 68, when Deleuze finally became interested in politics for the first time. Together with his good friend, the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari, Deleuze wrote the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which is indeed an attack on capitalism. In the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari also attack identity politics for internalizing the identities projected onto minorities. Their critique is that identity politics make a minority's suppressed status an integral part of their identity, inhibiting their capacity for self-creation. What Deleuze and Guattari thinks minorities should do instead is experiment with new forms of expression, move beyond boundaries and discover new modes of being. When comparing this to Peterson's claim, we see he is wrong on both counts. Not only is Deleuze opposed to identity politics, but he is also openly Marxist, making it nonsensical to say that he disguised Marxism as identity politics. Furthermore, Slavoj Žižek has accused Deleuze of being secretly pro-capitalist, making Peterson's claim even more ridiculous. A thinker more in line with Peterson's claim would be Jean Baudrillard. His early works were explicitly Marxist, but gradually he began to turn on Marxism. In Symbolic Exchange and Death, Baudrillard argues that Marxism is a part of a binary system of mutual opposition that sustains capitalism. To illustrate what he means by this, let's think of a game of chess. It can only be played when 2 players are opposed to each other. Likewise, Baudrillard believes traditional Marxism contribute to stabilizing the rules of capitalism by giving it an opponent to play with. In the introduction to the same book, Baudrillard scholars Mike and Nicholas Gain explain that Baudrillard acted as a force of de-radicalization on many Marxists, as he made them realize the importance of the symbolic. This is illustrated by a quote Baudrillard brings up in many of his books, which reads, "People do not desire revolution, but its spectacle." Furthermore, Baudrillard argues that the masses are a force of inertia which prevents change, rather than being a force for revolution, as Marx believed. When it comes to identity politics, Baudrillard really doesn't seem to concern himself much with it. He even uses the term savages to refer to native population, which isn't exactly politically correct. So Peterson is once again way off base. However, we're now approaching the 2 postmodern philosophers Peterson mentions by name.
Well, it seems to me that's Michel Foucault in the middle, and a more reprehensible individual you could hardly ever discover or even dream up, no matter how twisted your imagination. And I mean completely. So I can give you an example in one term. Jacques Derrida, who's head trickster for the postmodernist movement, regarded Western...
Let us start with Derrida. Thankfully, Peterson is a little bit more specific with his critique of Derrida than when he speaks of postmodernism generally. Let's look at a small sample.
Central claim of postmodernism, a claim which I think is actually correct and which also has bedeviled many other fields. The claim is something like, there is an infinite number of ways to interpret any even finite set of phenomena. And that actually happens to be true. It's the thing that's interesting about that claim, apart from the fact that it happens to be technically true, is that you can use it to mount an assault on any interpretation of anything whatsoever, because there is a tremendous variability in the number of interpretations that you could bring to bear on a situation. Then you can instantly jump to the conclusion or expound the proposition that none of those interpretations should be privileged above any others. Now, that's actually wrong.
So, the crux of Peterson's complaint is that Derrida is a relativist. This is a childish misconception that I'll allow Rick Roderick to clear up. Listen to this.
Derrida makes the outrageous claim that in the last analysis, there is no such thing as the right reading, the right interpretation. There is no interpretation that can bring interpretation to an end. Good books, really great texts, do not cut off interpretation, they lead to multiple interpretations. Now, the converse is the claim that people find outrageous, but it's not made by Derrida. That means since there's no the right way, then any way is as good as any other. Now, Derrida is not compelled to hold that view, and he doesn't. Not every way to speak and or read is as good as every other. But this is a familiar mistake, and it's made about a lot of Derrida's work. Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this. That is a straw person argument. No one in the world believes it or ever has believed it. No one, Derrida or anyone else, believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Okay, so Derrida is not a relativist, but is he a neo-Marxist in disguise? Well, one of Derrida's most important works, Of Grammatology, was published in 1967, before May 68. As such, it is unlikely that Derrida was trying to disguise his Marxism, as Marxism was still in vogue. He had no reason to disguise it, so a more likely explanation is that he simply moved in a different direction. As ContraPoints and Jonas Cheka have both made more substantial rebuttals covering Derrida, I won't go into more detail here. Instead, I'll move on to the last of our postmodern thinkers, Michel Foucault. Here again, Peterson makes more substantial remarks, this time concerning power, which was what Foucault focused his studies on. Let's listen.
What I see as most corrosive about the postmodern types, especially those who've derived themselves from Foucault, let's say, is that the idea that every hierarchy, or the hierarchy as such, is predicated on power is actually an assault on the idea of competence itself. And that, in turn, is an assault on the idea that there are real problems that can actually be solved. Here's three possibilities. I mean, one is the accusation that all there is power is the justification for use of power.
Of course, yes.
So that's handy, if that's what you want to use. So then there's another problem, and that goes along with the failure, the willful failure to distinguish competence from tyranny and power, let's say, because we might think of power as unearned authority, something like that, because we need a definition of power. And I think that
Peterson is making it seem like Foucault believed power to be inherently bad. But here is something Foucault himself said about power. Power and knowledge directly imply one another. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. It is clear from these lines that Foucault sees power not as something inherently bad, but as something that exists naturally and is even necessary, completely contradicting Peterson's allegations. I could say more, but Jonas Cheka has already covered it in some detail, so I'll just leave a few links in the description. Lastly, I want to thank Peterson for misrepresenting postmodernist thinkers, because if he hadn't, I might never have looked into them, and I would have lost out on some of the most interesting ideas I've ever come across. Maybe I'll make more videos about some of the other stupid things Peterson says, but this is it for now. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye!